Mercedes, honestly, I'm so glad you're not wearing that mask. It had me so frightened. I looked up and I was like, just taken aback. And I've been thinking about that mask. It's been in my nightmares for the last few days. Thank you.
And I couldn't find it this morning.
Ah! Well, hopefully it's lost forever. All right, I suppose we can get started. We have about 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23 people in the classroom, so I suppose we can technically start. That's technically. How's everyone doing? How's life? How's everyone weekend? Mine was filled with nightmares of the Joker mask. But others, how's yours? Billy?
This is a friendly reminder, buy your airplane tickets at the airport, because I did that on my way to school this morning, and it would have cost me $120 to go back home to Illinois for Thanksgiving. Instead, it only cost me $58 for a round trip tickets, yeah.
Why?
So
Why is that the case? Why is it?
I have absolutely no idea. But I also do know on my receipt, it said that the actual tickets were only $8 and some cents. The fares were like $49 and some cents. Or did I say fares? I meant fees, like fees and taxes.
What's the route travel?
Huh?
What's the routes from Tampa to Illinois?
I'm flying Spirit Tampa to O'Hare, and then I take the train down to my hometown in the middle of nowhere.
Okay.
Spirit sucks. They're always delayed. Also, they have the worst color scheme.
They are also super cheap though.
That is true.
I was literally gonna book a flight from Spirit yesterday, and I went on Reddit and I saw like all the reviews, and I was like, nope.
You have to pay for your clothes you carry, you have to pay for your backpack.
They've been canceling flights.
I've flown like dozens of times. I haven't actually had that much bad luck with Spirit.
Oh, you have to carry on the
You get a free personal item.
Like if it's the size of a backpack, you don't have to.
Aren't there seats
Really?
like
And you have to buy a.
Hmm.
And then my
It has a lot of turbulence. Like there's always so much turbulence when I fly Spirit. I feel like the pilot
I just saw the reviews.
cracked both times.
All right,
They
okay.
fly for a
Oh,
couple
wow.
hours in the car for a couple of days.
All right, let's get back. Let's bring it back. Thank you for completely throwing your class into disarray, Billy.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say something about the friendly reminder, which suggests you have said something about it before. I thought you were going to remind us about your ethics and debate team.
Oh, I mean, yeah, if you want to join,
Yeah, whatever.
just
This is way cooler. Fly to Illinois for $58.
round trip.
Round trip. From Tampa, Florida. Anything else happening in the world that's of interest to you always?
Isn't there a paper shortage? I feel like I heard something about their.
Paper shortage.
Yeah, like my sister, she went to Costco to buy toilet paper, but there is no toilet paper because people
Oh,
are
it's
buying
happening
out
again.
all the toilet.
It's happening
Oh.
again.
Let's go.
This is why we live in a Jahili society. We'll talk about more. So,
The Pandora Papers on King
right.
of Jordan showed that he owned properties all over the US and the UK that weren't registered under government. Like official government papers.
So I saw, okay, this is too old a meme for most people to get. Has anyone here seen the original Jurassic Park? Alright, this is a scene in the original Jurassic Park when the agent of the other park goes to Newman from Seinfeld and wants to steal, gives him the Barbasol can, and Newman talks out loudly, and the guy's like, shh. And then basically Newman sort of declares to everybody the plan. He's like, see, nobody cares. So I saw a meme of the Pandora Papers talking to the Panama Papers, telling them that they're rich people with properties all around the world that they stashed away and making lots of money and not paying any taxes on it. Nobody cares.
It's just in Jordan, it's like a hot debate because there's people literally putting themselves in refugee camps because they can't afford the property taxes in Jordan.
Right.
So people are seeing their king with these
I
offshore
remember when he
properties.
ascended to the throne. The
I thought he
BBC
was like
guy.
a good person though.
I'm Jordanian. He's
Uh,
like any type of monarch that you'd expect. He like presents himself as a good person, but really.
But
I thought he was like more like liberal in his.
I mean, he attempts to like pander to like Western audiences. And a lot of the times, he proposes ideas for Western investments. So a lot of the times, his people, like Palestinians in the country, are left behind. So there's, I don't want to talk about it too much. But,
no, I mean, there's a certain sort of, I mean, I don't know much about Jordanian, I don't know anything about Jordanian politics, except to say that there is the sort of the veneer of, around royalty that I think the PR department, every royal house sort of cultivates. I remember when he ascended the throne, it was like, the dashing young reformer, Prince Abdullah will now be the King Abdullah with his beautiful wife, Queen Rania. Right, and then there's magazine covers on People magazine and in the UK on whatever, the OK magazine. It's, the reality on the ground for every leader is different than the image that we have. Anyway, all right, Caesar mentions the possible forced reunification of Taiwan and China, which if it were to be attempted, technically should lead to a war.
Can you call it reunification then? I feel like that's a bit of a misnomer.
The Chinese version, the reunification of Taiwan and China. I don't know. If it were actually, now would be, some people were saying now would be the time to actually attempt it because the US is withdrawing from empire, from its imperial outposts, and so will it now in this moment be willing to go back into a much more protracted war with an enemy that in almost every simulation that the US Navy has fought, it has lost? Will it go for a full-on war with China? I doubt it. We'll see. But technically, legally, it's required to. And if it doesn't adhere to its treaty obligations, then all the treaty obligations that the US has signed with any country in the world basically falls apart and leads to a complete restructuring of international alliances away from the US. So, interesting times. Andrew.
On the topic of the Panama Papers, there was a whole thing about the finance minister in Brazil owning I want to say over 20 million in financial assets that he all moved offshore. And then within 3 hours, there was a poll showing President Bolsonaro losing in the presidential election by 30 points.
Right. Dude, that's so funny to me. The guy only made 20 million. He only stashed away 20 million.
I could be getting the number wrong.
To have a couple of $1 billion stashed away.
Yeah.
20 million is peanuts. That's how much those guys make in interest every month.
No, yeah, but that financial minister is kind of known for being probably the dumbest financial minister out of all the major BRICS powers.
Stash away 20 million.
Yeah.
All right. Well, lots of corruption in the world. The China thing, Caesar. Thank you very much. It'll allow us to sort of come back to this question in a moment. All right. So I'll start by confessing to you that this portion of the book is difficult for me to teach. It's difficult for me to teach because I'm discomfited by what we read. How many people are reading for today? Chapters 3 and 4? 2 people. Any? 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 6 people? It's not easy to walk away and say, I like this guy. I don't think that rolls off the tongue very easily, and most likely it shouldn't. So for me, it's a little more difficult to try and explain this person's thought and why we should be interested in it. apart from, the more generic, well, why does Islamic terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism, why is it sometimes training its guns on the United States? Beyond that security question of why we should care, the attempt to actually understand it, this thought on its own terms, is it can be a little discomforting because this thought is not a very comforting thought. So what I want to try and do today, as part of the recap, is set the stage for our encounter with Sayyid Qutb. And one of the things as part of the setting of the stage is going to be looking at critiques of modern society from within the West. Critiques that Sayyid Qutb in various ways draws upon or reflects or refracts or constructs on his own. Although he puts them together in ways that are utterly unrecognizable to us, perhaps, but my job is to make the unfamiliar somewhat familiar. And to say that even though the things that he says are, or the things that people have drawn from him are heinous, the critiques that he has made are not that strange, given our own history of Western political thought. So, before I do that, a bureaucratic announcement. I finished grading your papers. I just stupidly have not released the grades. I shall do so when I get to my office after class. I'll release the grades. Please look them over. You will see that I, for the most part, for many of you, I have given some short comments. For everybody, what I have done is that I've broken down your grade on 3 parameters. The thesis, 5 points, the body of the paper out of 20 points, and the conclusion out of 5 points. Nobody got, the body's 20 points, so, it's like thesis, 5 out of 5 is the maximum you could get. The body, 20 out of 20 is the maximum you could get. And the conclusion is 5 out of 5 is the maximum you could get. Now, with the thesis, I gave you 5 out of 5 points if you had a clear thesis statement, you had clearly identified the resources you were going to use to make your argument, and you clearly identified your own position vis-a-vis the prompt that I had given. If you did all of those things in a clear way, you got 5 points for it, per round. And as for the conclusion, if you had a nice concluding paragraph, if you had a concluding paragraph that summed up your argument and you had a bibliography at the end, you got 5 out of 5. And in the body of the paper, all of the things I had mentioned to you before about your use of evidence, the way you developed your argument, the kind of the way the argument, sort of strung together, how it developed, all of those things that are somewhat objective, somewhat subjective, came together to constitute the points for the body of the paper. Again, I don't think anybody got 20 out of 20. If you did, congratulations. I usually don't do that unless I've been really impressed with your paper. But for the most part, that's how things went for everybody. Now, the reason I say that is because I was late in finishing grading your papers, for which I apologize profusely. But I will also say that one other fault I will admit to, which is when one is grading as many papers as one is grading, and especially when they are sort of, everyone has the same set of prompts, it often happens that one loses a sense for differentiating one answer from another. Like, you read the same answer multiple times, it becomes a little harder to be attentive to the particularities of the argument and the way it has been made by each individual student. And what that means is that it's entirely possible that I read your essay, but somehow because I'm tired, because my brain is just not working as sharply in that particular moment when I encountered your paper, it's entirely possible that I missed something important about your argument. I misunderstood something you were saying. Something you had done, I did not give you points for. That's entirely possible. I cop up to it. What I would ask you to do is to come to me and explain why you think you've been done wrong by my grading. But before you do that, and this is the crucial point, I've copped to my faults. I will ask you to do the following. Before you come and talk to me, what I want you to do is I want you to read your paper. And to the extent possible, read your paper with dispassionate eyes. It's been now at least 2 or 3 weeks since you submitted the paper. although you may have been very invested in the paper when you wrote it, although its arguments would have made a lot of sense to you in the immediate aftermath of you writing it, I think enough time has elapsed for those arguments to seem fresh to you. So I want you to look at them with those fresh eyes of yours and see if your memory and your idea of what you think you have done corresponds to what you actually have done. Andrew.
Sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but the next major paper, that's on the 20th, right?
I don't know, I have to look at the syllabus. Is it?
All right. I remember you saying we had to submit 2 journal entries before the 20th, so I don't know if that's when the next paper is, or,
I think this is when the next paper is due.
okay.
But I have not yet constructed the prompt yet, so we're very far away from that. But that was off topic. Thank you for throwing me off.
Sorry about that.
Read your paper with fresh eyes. See if, in fact, the arguments that you think you've made have been made in the way that you think you made them. Maybe have somebody else read your paper. If all of those things lead you to believe that you've been done wrong, please bring your paper to me. I'll be happy to look it over. I'll be happy to explain to you my reasoning. If the need arises for changing your grade, I will change your grade. But be warned, I can change your grade either way. I can see your paper and be like, of course you wrote a perfect thesis paragraph. What was I thinking? Why did I give you 3 out of 5? Absolutely 5 out of 5. Or I could say, wow, I gave you 3 out of 5 for this? If you look at it with dispassionate eyes, this should actually be 1 out of 5. So that's also possible. Unlikely, but it's also possible. But what I'm saying is, please take some time to think it over after you get the paper, get my comments and your grades back before you come and talk to me. Yes, Mercedes.
Oh, I have my hand raised.
Oh, yeah, okay. Ariana?
So like how did the class do for their first essay? Like, were there mostly A's or B's or like?
Well, so I'm not at liberty to sort of, let me put it to you this way. If this was a multiple choice exam, then the answer to that question would make sense. Simply because then I could say, look, everybody had the same set of questions and same options to answer amongst. But with essays, there's so much variation in terms of how people write, how they use the resources, that I don't think the answer to that question would convey any information. Overall, I was happy. I've been worried about how well I'm explaining this stuff. Something the Chinese political thought is it's not my area of expertise. And so I was worried about how much I was able to transmit. I was happy with that. What I was surprised by sometimes, I must admit, is the very unusual interpretations of Antigone that I came across. But those were few and far in between. Largely, I was happy with everybody's grade.
You also usually get a box plot with the grade that has the distribution of people's grades.
I don't know why they share that. Like, why that information is relevant to people.
I mean, I like it because like if I'm below the average, then I know, okay, like I need to kick up my game and like dedicate more time to this class. And if I'm like way above the average, then yeah, maybe I slack off in a class a little bit more. But at least it works if I'm like below the
I
average.
know how it works. Whether it actually is pedagogically useful into making you a better student is the last question. All it breeds is either it breeds a sense of massive injustice or a sense of massive superiority. And both of those things are kind of missing the point. It has no place really in the classroom. All right, but I was happy overall. If you aren't happy, I'll happily read this. Okay, let's get to the business at hand. So, a couple of things I want to talk about before we get into Kutub itself. Right? So, one of the things I want to talk about, and Maria is not here today, apologies again to her for that, and to all of you for forcing you to look at Christopher Hitchens. Listened to him last time, but what I was trying to do, just to remind you again, was to show you that there were all these fairy tales, really, that people were telling about the shape of the future. And they were drawing upon either of two, or in the case of Hitchens, both seemingly opposing views. One was the Francis Fukuyama story, where eventually liberal democracy, the kind of society in which we live, will win out against all competing ideologies and belief systems, and that if you encounter any belief system that is not a liberal democracy in 2021, it is merely an archaic remnant. It's like cavemen living in 2021. They have no business being around, and the sooner they're eviscerated or persuaded, I'm sure Fukuyama would believe, to the benefits of liberal democracy, the better it is. Or you had the Samuel Huntington variety, which said there is an inevitable clash of civilizations that are predetermined along, the vector of beliefs and religion and ethnicity and race, perhaps. And these clashes are inevitable. At the end of the Cold War, the Cold War was a family dispute, was a family squabble between fairly similar sets of belief systems, when the real belief systems that are actually contrary to our own are civilizationally different, Islam being the big one for Huntington. And so my job last time was to show you that the received opinion of fairly intelligent people, even if delivered sometimes in ways that were, actually, I think Christopher Hitchens would be cancelled today for the kind of things he says, and perhaps somewhat, I wouldn't say rightly or wrongly, but I think there would be good reason behind people who try to do that to him. Or they would have a better argument than they would have had in 2011 when he did so. When people like Christopher Hitchens, who were considered smart people, were saying this was a received opinion. My reason for telling you that also is to then segue into the next point, which is remembering geopolitics. Now, if you remember, when we were talking about, was it Carine Defort? That was her name? Is there such a thing as Chinese philosophy, the article that we read? Right? I said to you, remember that in the background of that question, or in the debate that Defort so elegantly reconstructs for us, there is something lurking. And that something lurking is the question of geopolitics. Now remember, Kirtana was very impressed by the logical beauty of the argument that Defort had constructed about the various positions that might be taken for or against the idea, whether there's such a thing as Chinese philosophy. Do you remember this? Yeah, you said you really liked the logical nature of her argument.
Oh.
You did say that.
Okay.
What I said to you was, the question of whether there's such a thing as Chinese philosophy is not an idle question purely for academics, right? If the basis for when countries like Britain, France, Belgium, the Dutch, when they colonized other countries, they justified their naked aggression by putting on a little fig leaf. And that fig leaf said, we are culturally advanced than the people we're colonizing. The direct effect of our colonial rule will be to transmit to these poor, benighted savages the benefits of our advanced civilization. Now, the rhetorical structure of that claim was as follows. You, poor, benighted people of the world, are not as advanced as we are. Not only does this mean that we have the right to rule you, but we have, in fact, an obligation to rule you. You can call it, as Rudyard Kipling called it, the white man's burden, or civilizational burden of improving the lives of the people who are being ruled. So rhetorically, the claim was, we will rule you because we can make you better, and you need to be made better because you lack certain things that we consider to be essential to being an advanced civilization. Amongst those were things like cultural, products, like philosophy. And so when the Chinese have a conversation about whether their system of thought should be considered philosophical in the same way as Greek philosophy is considered philosophical, that is not just a question of identifying concepts and classifying them correctly. There is a geopolitical argument. There's an argument about identity and dignity lurking in the background. So I want you to remember this, because when you come to Sayyid Qutb in a moment, a similar concern is in the background. His is one answer to a geopolitical question. An answer that we may not agree with, but an answer that arises to a set of problems that he and many other people in many other colonies around the world were trying to answer in their own way. So his is not just a question of theology, although as Yuban shows wonderfully well, he uses Islamic theology in interesting ways to make his claims. But the reason why he's making the claims he's making, the problems that he's trying to answer, are problems that are geopolitical. In the same way as my purpose in reminding you of the Defoe article, the question of the Chinese philosophy thing was geopolitical. And finally, the thing that I wanted to talk about last time, we ran out of time. I wanted to show a video, but frankly, I just don't know how I would show you guys a video, have people online see the video. But if you get a chance, this is what I want you to watch. It's a Star Trek Next Generation episode. It's called Darmok, D-A-R-M-O-K. Has anyone seen that? What is it about, Nick?
Honestly, it's probably like the best episode of Star Trek.
It is the best episode of Star Trek. Darmok and Tanagra.
Yeah, it's all about how they meet this civilization who has a concept of language that they can't even comprehend. Like they all have like communicators that can automatically translate like any species that they've ever found. And this is the first one that they found that they can't. And they can understand the words, but like the structure of their language is so unique. Like they literally cannot like understand anything that they're saying. And so they end up getting in a conflict with them. And the whole episode is them trying to like solve the conflict while trying to understand their language. It's really good.
It's a fantastic episode. Okay,
Is that the one where they have like the translators and stuff like that?
Yeah, so it's like, so the basic gist is this. Like, as Nick said, you can understand the words, you don't know what the words put together mean, right? So, and so,
I think I saw that.
I'll just say it one more time, Nick, so that everybody's on the same page. So, in Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is a space sci-fi show, the Federation is a bunch of planets, including Earth, that send out ships to explore new worlds and seek out new civilizations to boldly go where no one has gone before. And in the process, they encounter a civilization with whom they cannot communicate. With every other civilization, they can communicate because, as Andrew says, they have translators that can simply transform whatever is being said into direct language. Star Trek very frequently does not even acknowledge such a thing as bumpy space, which I talked about when we were talking about the Defoe article. But with this civilization, they have a problem, because while they can understand the words, they cannot understand what the words put together mean. And the way they describe it is like, if I said to you, Juliet on her balcony, what does that convey to you? What does it convey to you?
Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, what does it convey to you?
Something romantic?
Exactly. But for that to be the case, you have to know about Romeo and Juliet, right? So, lacking the ability to understand what the context within which words are being said mean, you cannot actually communicate with someone. And so, in that entire episode is an attempt to try and communicate. But the result of that entire experience, the communication fails. They failed. The Federation, Jean-Luc Picard, and the alien captain failed to understand each other perfectly. But they are able to create the basis of an understanding. And what it shows, but the best part of that episode is towards the end, when Jean-Luc Picard is reading the Iliad, I think, and he explains to number one, or number two, his second in command, that so much of our language is dependent upon tropes and motifs and metaphors, and that this encounter with an alien world help Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, the captain, reflect back on how language is structured for us humans and how our understanding assumes certain things. And so the reason I say that, and I wanted to show the episode, I cannot possibly convey to you the beauty of that episode. But the reason I wanted to talk about it is because dialogical understanding does that. When we talk about, when we talk about what he calls, Jahili society, am I pronouncing that correctly? Jahili? Yeah. When he talks about, modern society as uncivilized, as barbaric, it may seem very strange to us, but a dialogical understanding will say, hold on, what resources in our tradition, which we take to be completely normal and acceptable, make critiques that are similar? And so that's what Yuban is trying to get us to do. So from that in mind, let's get to the heart of today's lecture, which is Sayyid Qutb's critique of modern society. So very quickly, we'll come to this more in a moment. Very quickly, according to Sayyid Qutb, who's an Islamic fundamentalist thinker, perhaps the most important Islamic fundamentalist thinker in the modern world, he died in the 60s, I think. Modern society, modern Western society, is uncivilized, is barbaric. And the only antidote to that is an Islamic society. Only Islam, as Sayyid Qutb understands it, which he understands, as we saw last time, in a fundamentalist way by going back to the texts themselves and interpreting them in the light of modern contemporary problems, only an Islam understood in that way, Sayyid Qutb says, fits the bill of the solution to the nature of modern society as a barbaric, uncivilized society. Now, as I say this to you, this comment should, you're listening to me, online and in person, this comment should strike you as being utterly strange, for we are nothing but civilized. Look at how wonderfully we treat each other. Spencer raises his hand like a civilized person. I say, yes, Spencer, like a civilized person. Spencer, go ahead.
So you said he wrote this in like this before the 60s?
He died in the 60s.
He died in the 60s?
Yeah.
So I was trying to like give his like writing some context. Because I can see like a barbaric society like after coming off of, or viewing Western society as barbaric and like atrocious after coming off like World War I, then World War II.
Sure,
all
yeah,
of
yeah,
the,
yeah.
atrocities and terrible things
Yeah.
that happened in the war.
Right. You would be right. Except that I'm pretty sure Sayyid Qutb was around today, and certainly people who take him to be an authority, who speak in the language of Sayyid Qutb, they would say that our society today is uncivilized as well.
Does human means uncivilized?
No, Western society is uncivilized.
I can see that.
Only Islamic society more particularly, according to Sayyid Qutb, that formed in the initial stages of when the Prophet Muhammad showed up in Medina and established Islamic rule. The original Islamic society is the best Islamic society. Everything else is a departure from that. It's uncivilized. Now the interesting thing, and I'm alerting you to this right now because we have so many classes you guys are taking, so many texts we're reading, these things will disappear from your mind inevitably. You will discover later on Gandhi makes, for different reasons in a different way, but he makes the same kind of argument. Western society is uncivilized. In fact, he was famously asked the question, what do you think of Western civilization? And he says, oh, I think it would be a good idea. And the reasons why he says that are very different from the reasons that Qutb says. But this critique of the West as being uncivilized is something that a lot of people share. Partly, as Spencer rightly points out, because of what they're witnessing. But in Qutb's case, for other reasons. And the most important reason, is that according to Sayyid Qutb, the reason why Western society is uncivilized is because it assumes that human beings can be the source of the authority of government. Whereas in a truly civilized society, all authority flows from and is recognized as belonging to God. Human beings relying on Western rationality, relying on Western philosophy, to ask all sorts of questions that is not the business of human beings to be asking, leads to a world that is fundamentally uncivilized. Now, I hope, based purely on what I've said so far, that claim should sound absurd to you. Right? Or are people like, yeah, Western society is uncivilized. The original Islamic society was the only one that I want to live in.
I mean, I don't know anything about the original Muslim society, but like I can definitely see the perspective of like uncivilized Western world.
Give me one.
Well, I think things along the line, like I heard a quote, it was like war is just it's just natural selection played out on a grand scale, and I think that's the way that Western societies definitely approach their own like societal like dominion, like each country, how they view their sovereignty is a constant struggle to stay alive and to stay like relevant or influential. And so there's a constant struggle.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so perfect. So according to Spencer, as he rightly points out, sovereignty, into the very logic of sovereignty, is built in the DNA of conflict. In order to maintain your sovereignty against the sovereignty of another country, you are inevitably pitted against other human beings whom you are enjoined to kill, because lest you kill them, they will kill you. And so that is already uncivilized. Perfect. Any other examples? Sarah?
Some people, like in Islamic countries, see people in the West as unclean
Why?
because they don't properly clean themselves after they defecate. It's an
Okay, so that's quite literal.
no, like literally.
I mean, I was thinking more conceptually.
Like, even back home, like, people have that idea of the West, like, they're unclean because of that one aspect. Like, even though it's a small, ridiculous statement.
What is it? Okay. No, I see what you're saying. I'm trying to think of more conceptually what is that indicating? What is the, like?
Like, uncivilized, like, from the Sayyid Qutb argument.
Okay, all right. So the unclean.
You don't have to write that.
No, I'll write it anyway. This generally unclean. There's one respect. So Qutb actually came to the U.S. He was sent by the Egyptian government to the U.S. in the hopes of making him less radical. And coming here actually radicalized him even further. And of all the things apparently that he disliked about the U.S., there's one thing I'll be like, I can kind of see your point there, which is the enormous amount of time people spend on their yards to make them look pretty. He's like, why do you do that? And I agree, why? If you don't do it, the HOA is going to slap a fine on you. That's why I do it. But I feel like compelled. Anyway, Mercedes, Andrew.
I have 2 points, one about the yard and then one about why
Sure.
I could see. I don't necessarily disagree with his analysis that Western society, like he just disagrees with it, because Western society really places an emphasis on the individual and the importance of everything is up to our choices, and it's like the ultimate authority is a rational kind, which means humans make rational decisions. And I think that for a lot of people, it's just like you're putting too much weight in the human aspect because ultimately you don't have the most control. It's a lot of it, it's saying that you're controlling things that you don't have power over. So I can understand why you would make irrational choices based on the assumption that you're in control when in many cases you're not.
Well, but the argument, Mercedes, was that the argument about the yard or was it about?
No, just about like religion.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
it's
So-
just like.
So I think, look, no, but wait, just before we go and sort of embrace the critique of modern society, a la, Sayyid Qutb.
Well, I don't think we're uncivilized. I just think that I can understand why you would see it as barbaric because it's so separated from things that people really understand, and they say it's your highest power is not people, but if you insist on that, you can see why people would think you're uncivilized.
I mean, I think it's the grandeur and the dignity of the system. Again, judge it not by, don't judge this necessarily by its actual outcomes. Judge it by the principles it espouses. The principle of Western society is the inherent dignity and respect of the individual. And while certainly that may lead to suboptimal results, that's the mark of civilization. What's your name again, sir? Stephen.
I remember in the reading at some point, I forget where it was, that he made a point, or
Who?
that, well, the author says that Sayyid Qutb's
Sure.
perspective on it is something that makes the West uncivilized is their departure, or beginning of departure from the family unit. So I guess it was mostly in reference to women going out into the workplace, and he saw it like that as
Oh, yeah.
something that shouldn't be
Yeah,
happening.
him and Pat Robertson. Andrew.
I kind of have a question about Spencer's point earlier with sovereignty and conflict and all that, because both from his writings and from a historical perspective, I could be wrong. I don't really feel like he disagrees with that, because it's like, I haven't really brushed up on my Arabic in a long time, so I don't know how you pronounce this, like a Jahiliya society, you know what I mean? He felt that that was directly in conflict with Islamic society, and he advocated for, jihad and, taking over that. And so I don't really feel like he necessarily disagrees that sovereignty should come from conflict. I mean, it should derive from, God and
No, I think so.
his laws, but also from like a historical
No, but I
standpoint.
think it's just on that point. I'm just on that point. So I'm going to rely again on Sama Ummah. This is an Islamic community, right? Which says whether you are incidentally, sort of the Nation of Islam exists in a very sort of unusual relationship today. But whether you are in California or you are in Saudi Arabia or whether you are in Bangladesh or you are in the Philippines, you are part of the same Islamic community. And that's the Ummah.
Yeah.
Within the Ummah, there are no distinctions of class, gender, very important. Class, race, ethnicity are not relevant distinctions. National boundaries are not necessarily distinctions to be concerned about. So, for example, in the wars fought against Israel by Arab nations, Pakistan, for instance, has lent its air force to fight an external battle, right? Suggesting, therefore, that the notion of sovereignty, which usually is antithetical to the principle of lending your physical defense forces in the aid of a conflict far, far away, that sovereignty was no barrier to the protection of what was considered the Ummah. Protection of the Palestinian people in Israel justified, on this view, the erasure of national borders and the emphasis on the community of Islam.
Sure, but I mean, he tried to kill Nasser, but so would he consider like a lot of those like pan-Arabist secular governments as being part of that community, or like?
No, that's because
Okay.
because the problem with them is that they have taken nationalism. Nationalism is also a departure from God's law.
Yeah.
Or some version of socialism. Communism is the worst possible thing. They've taken these principles as the basis of government, when in fact the basis of government is God himself alone. And that's why, killing Anwar Sadat, for instance, in Egypt, or trying to assassinate, Nasser, all of this stuff is justified because these people are enemies of Islam,
Okay.
understood as a community devoted to Islam itself.
Okay, so those governments are not, okay.
Right.
I'm not sure how relevant this is, but it kind of reminds me of the Amish community. Like for them, it's like their society or their community, it's all based off of God's law. So they don't really have like a government, but it's just God's law is what is their government, and that's it.
Right. So think of it this way, right? I think Amish and Seikutim interestingly exist in the same universe on this one question of where authority of our rules come from, whereas in almost every other respect they would have nothing in common with each other. Think of it this way. We say this statement all the time, right? But how many of you, American citizens here, who went to school in the US, had to do the Gettysburg Address? Anybody?
Perform it
for
or?
class or whatever. 4 years ago, our ancestors came upon this land, blah, 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 blah. What's the final line of that thing?
Great question.
Or it's one of the final lines. Government of the people, for the people, by the people shall not perish from this earth. Right?
Wait, what is this that you're reciting?
Gettysburg Address, right? The Gettysburg Address.
Oh.
Am I getting it right? Or did I missing the wrong? I'm getting the wrong address applying it here.
I think that's right.
Right. Okay. So look at those phrases. For the people, of the people. On those two statements, Qutb would be like, yeah, of course. Government exists for the people. Government even is of the people. It's made of what is called the vice regents of Allah on earth. But the statement government by the people, what that statement says in the Gettysburg Address is authority for the government derives from the people. They are the ones who say, yes, you, Mr. Lincoln, please make laws that will, or in conjunction with Congress, make laws that will apply to everybody. But the moment you make laws that we don't like, we will withdraw our support from you. Government is authorized to do the things it is capable of doing on the view of Abraham Lincoln and indeed on the view of democratic societies everywhere, from the authority given to it by the people. And there, Qutb would say, nope, nothing doing. Government can be for the people, government can be of the people, but it can never be by the people, because government is by the authority of God, as understood in the original Islamic fundamentalist text, to which Qutb wants to draw your attention. Now, I want to bring it to, it's funny, we're spending more time talking about Qutb when traditionally that should be the more difficult thing to try and get to. Let's talk about stuff within Western political thought, because if the dialogical understanding says, oh, look at the strange stuff, but hold on, we are strange as well. There are things that Qutb says, and in fact, he actively quotes from them in his own writings. This guy has read stuff. He's not just making stuff up. He actually quotes some, not feminist critiques, but Nietzsche and Rousseau, definitely. He quotes stuff within our tradition of Western political thought. So who said individualism is supreme in the West? Mercedes, right? So Rousseau thinks of the entire sort of social contract that we have signed as a fraudulent social contract. Has anyone here read Rousseau? Does anyone know the Discourse on Inequality? Okay, very briefly, very briefly. Rousseau traces the evolution of mankind from its original state of nature, which is very different from the Hobbesian state of nature, to the society in which we live today. His first line of the social contract is, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. What does he mean by that? He says, in the beginning, human beings were all free, they were able to do whatever they wanted to do, but over time, because of certain propensities within human beings, they signed on to a system of government that benefits the rich over the poor, that erases your individuality and makes you submit to an unequal society. And in the process, you are basically giving away your own liberty. You are chaining yourself to a society where the hope of individual advancement prevents you from ever seeing anything beyond your immediate gaze. That sounds too abstract. Let me just give you one quick example. In Rousseau, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, private property does not exist in the state of nature. Everything is given to everybody. There's enough stuff around. If you feel hungry, pluck an apple, eat it. If somebody else has plucked the apple you were gonna eat, just go down and pluck another apple and eat that. Nothing belongs to you because everything is given to everybody. Like you can't claim the apple tree as yours forever. Until one day some person says, this property is mine. Claims this tree is mine. And has people stupid enough to believe him, that person creates private property. And what that means then is that it creates a system where some people have a lot and most people have nothing. And this system is unsustainable. Except the way they sustain it, where the rich are able to sustain an unequal system, is by telling the poor, hey, someday you might be rich. Wouldn't you want your stuff protected? If you want your stuff protected, you should sign on to laws that will protect people's property. Because when you have your property, you don't want some random person stealing your property. And the poor people were stupid enough, Rousseau says, to basically sign on to the system. Every schmuck who goes and buys a lottery ticket and hopes to win but never pay taxes on it, because that's giving money to the poor. That schmuck, according to Rousseau, I'm using the word schmuck because Rousseau would probably call that person a schmuck. That schmuck is basically, he's been had by an unequal system, which has emphasized individuality, individual well-being over social well-being. And in the process has left most individuals worse off. The very system that's supposed to make them feel better has in fact made them feel worse off, has left them worse off. That's the way in which the society both elevates the individual and then treats him abysmally is very much part of the critique of Western society, of modern society. Think of all the people in the world who starve to death. Anyway, you know what? That's too much. That's too much. I'll just give you an example from our campus, University of South Florida, ranked what in the public university system?
54.
Public university system 54? Was it at 48? Did we break the top 50? Whatever. Some high number. How many students on this campus today, which is, most people are online, do you think have had enough to eat? Can afford to have enough to eat? I would suggest to you, not as many as you think, most likely. Certainly not everybody. Food scarcity is a real thing, even amongst our fair city, our wonderful university. And yet we as a society claim that we respect individual rights, we respect individual freedoms. How do we treat individuals? Rousseau would say abysmally. Qutb would say abysmally. So that's one critique that Qutb makes of Western society and how it treats the individual, that has resonances, for different reasons, but has resonances within the tradition of Western political thought. Rousseau is a respected thinker within the tradition of Western political thought. When I teach introductory political theory, when most of my colleagues in universities both here and elsewhere teach introductory political theory, we definitely teach Rousseau, who makes this critique. Nietzsche, I mentioned Nietzsche to you before when I talked to you about the greatest gift, about the eternal recurrence. But Nietzsche has a different argument to make, and this one I'm not sure, I'm interested to see. Based on the argument that was had between Andrew and John, to be an interesting repeat of that argument here, Nietzsche makes the argument that one of the worst things about modern civilization is the complete erasure of values. What he means by that is that if you want to go and have cereal that tastes like cheeseburger, and if you can find it, or we can make it and people will buy it, by all means, that abomination has every right to exist because somebody just thought of it and somebody will buy it. The fact that cheeseburger flavored cereal is an absolute abomination is no cause for banning it from all polite society, and yet that is precisely, Nietzsche says, what we should do. We have forgotten aristocratic values and have instead succumbed to democratic values. Now, what does he mean by aristocratic values? He doesn't mean, I'm going to have some tea and I'm going to be all aristocratic and stuff. He doesn't mean that. He means excellence. Values that promote excellence, values that promote greatness have been forgotten. And in its stead, we basically said everything goes. Everything in the society goes. Let me pause here and just ask you, do you understand what he means by that? When I say, in the society, everything goes. You do? Stephen?
Like, I understand, like, everything goes feels like an undermining of, like, democracy as a whole.
Oh yeah, Nietzsche hates democracy.
Like, it feels like an overgeneralization because not everybody doesn't love everything. Like, there's common things that democracy will trend towards that are most likely in conflict with the aristocratic values that he's talking about, but that doesn't mean everything.
He's not saying that in a democracy everybody believes the same things, apart from the one value that everybody should be allowed to believe everything. The fact that, like, you go to, I hope there is no cheeseburger flavored cereal out there, because that would just be like, we might as well just end society at that point. But you can imagine someone coming up with that product, and maybe Publix won't stock it because, most people are revolted by it. But if enough people will buy it, the logic of the market itself will dictate that at least some specialty stores, maybe Target will have it, maybe Trader Joe's will have it, maybe Lucky's will have it. You ever been to Lucky's yet? It's a store, also in Gainesville. If people will buy it, let's make it. But whether we should make it This is an altogether different question, which democracy cannot answer. Democracy is interested in giving everybody everything. Whereas some things should not be had. Some things are better left untouched. More importantly, there should be some values that we as a society should be cultivating. We should be increasing. We should have people display more of. But instead, because we worship equality, and equality, where your taste goes, your taste is cool, your taste is cool, everybody is dumbed down to the common level. As an example, and please forgive me for this, pumpkin spice lattes.
Drinking one right now.
I know!
It's
Everybody drinks those. Are they good?
yes.
Who's to say? Spencer has maintained his last aristocratic vestige before he also is reduced to the common folk. Everybody's tastes are dumbed down, everybody becomes the same. That argument, Qutb is also going to make. We don't know how to distinguish between high values and low values. We've emphasized all values having equal value. And that is a loss. According to Nietzsche, that's a loss according to Qutb. Ethan, you had your hand up and then I'll come to Mercedes.
I think it was just about democratic values, like you were just asking us if we knew what it meant.
Oh, what do you think it means?
I was just gonna say like, just sort of like bowing down to what everyone thinks, like everyone's voices and opinions are just, you try to listen to all of it. And then like, yeah, that's just what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, just everybody can have like their own podcast. Should everybody have their own podcast? No. Everybody can. And that is a loss. But Mercedes, you had a question.
So I was just confused. Is their argument that by by emphasizing equality, individual rights, you end up with a homogenized society, which means they don't want people to be similar?
No, I think,
Go ahead.
yeah, what I think he means is within a democratic society and in our liberal societies, we believe as long as you're not hurting anybody, you should be able to do it, or you're not hurting yourself, even if what you're doing could be seen as repugnant, right? Most people would be well, I hurt himself, so bye, right? We'll just leave the guy and go do whatever he wants in the swamp. So even if
Right, okay, sure. There is that, Spencer. You're absolutely right on that, and I agree with you. There's one further point, but Adri, go ahead. I'll make that point in a moment.
I was just gonna ask, would I be wrong in saying that Qutb supports or at least agrees with, in a sense, aristocratic values over democratic values, or?
Well, he does not like I don't think you would agree with what constitutes aristocratic values. I think Qutb may have no space for it, because this assumes human excellence.
Yeah, I don't think he would agree maybe with the
aristocratic
framing
values.
of aristocratic values.
But he would agree with the critique of the democratic values.
Yeah.
That part. I have to answer Mercedes in a moment, but Kirstana, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna ask, do you think our Congress is a good representation of being able to distinguish between aristocratic and democratic values?
How so?
Because we have our Senate and they all are basically in DC. They don't really get to travel as much as representatives would and get to know their region better. So I guess what our senators, they would be able to distinguish more between what are the principles that our Americans want or our.
In principle, certainly the Senate was not even supposed to be representative in the way that you would vote for for senators. That's a more recent development. In the original design of the Constitution, senators were appointed by the states. And they were meant to be, what's the phrase? The cooling plate, back in the day, you would drink tea with a saucer. You would pour the tea into the saucer to cool it, and then you would drink it from the saucer, or you put it back into the cup. The Senate was supposed to be the place that cools the passions of the people. The people say, we want tax cuts for everybody. Everybody gets a Pontiac. You get a Pontiac. Oprah. You get a Pontiac. You get a Pontiac. Everybody gets a Pontiac. Right, so Congress passes that, the House of Representatives passes that in resounding majority, but it goes to the Senate, where, because the senators originally are not responsive to their electoral fate to the people, they can say, well, hold on, should everybody be getting a Pontiac? How are we going to pay for Pontiacs? Is Pontiac, or Pontiac's even a good car? No. What are we gonna do with this? This piece of legislation, we're gonna veto it. And so the Senate was designed to be an aristocratic check on the democratic excesses of the House of Representatives. So yes, there's that part of it. But in response to what Spencer said, but to add to it, it's not just that, in our society we let people do whatever they want to do, no matter how crazy they are and how outlandish their views are. It's also the case that we don't encourage the right kinds of values. So according to Nietzsche, and this is it's a whole, people write dissertations on Nietzsche. I'm trying to say it in few sentences as possible. Man is a rope between animal and overman. Yes, that's how amazing that sentence was. Man is a rope between animal and overman. Ubermensch.
Okay, that's what
Ubermensch. No, wait, but the Nazis, they're the worst Nietzscheans. They don't know what they're talking about. What are the things that help us grow and flourish as human beings? They are not the values of pleasure of the palate. Eating chicken wings in the middle of the night might constitute a kind of freedom that lots of people will subscribe to, but it doesn't make you into a better being. Holding back, going for a jog in the morning or at night, exercising, putting yourself through some kinds of deprivation and hardships makes you into a harder being. It elevates you to a higher level. A society that can do that, can draw people towards the higher values, does not exist because society dumps things down. Society brings things down to the common level. That's why you can have Hardee's in the middle of the night. You can have Taco Bell 24 hours a day. Because we've built a society that says it's okay. It's okay to eat Taco Bell at 3 o'clock in the morning. Confess, how many of you do that?
I go to bed too.
Oh, very good. So at 1:30, Taco Bell. So anyway, my larger point is that the fact that all things go, that all things are acceptable, is to Nietzsche, as to a critic like Sayyid Qutb, something of an abomination, something that we should be cautious about. Yes?
I know that the specific, when they say that all things goes, they're critiquing like the social aspect, but it really seems like just by analysis, they're also inherently critiquing capitalism as well, because capitalism is anything that makes money goes, which means that like any behavior that's profitable is okay, which is, I know it's not the same, but I think it's at least similar in which it's
Sure,
a
it is.
reflection of our values.
Capitalism maps, sort of is seen as a advancer of democracy for reasons very similar to the ones you have said. But I think, and I want to move on to the Emerson part in a second, but the critique of democracy that Nietzsche has is the critique that he gets almost wholesale from Plato, who's writing at a time when there is no capitalism. But the critique is still the same. Democracy dumps things down to the common level and makes everything appear legitimate. Even things that should not be discussed are considered legitimate. The other thing that the Western critique, I mean, I put Emerson in there, you could put somebody else in there. We'll be reading, you'll be reading Emerson, I suppose, later in the semester. But how should I put this? So my encounter with the United States has been entirely through the university system. First time I came here as an undergrad, master's, second master's, PhD, now teaching at USF. Entirely the university. Which means I had no family here. And so the people that I interacted with, the people that I knew, were largely, as the professoriate tends to be, atheists. So in my mind, most of America is, at some fundamental level, in my mind, atheist. But that's, even though that statement is becoming more and more true, it's not entirely true. The vast majority of Americans have strong religious beliefs. But we've also created a system, political system, of a separation between church and state that does not let those religious beliefs have any political valence. And the reason we've done that is for very good reasons, which is the religious conflicts that engulfed Europe and led to, decades upon decades of civil wars that killed lots and lots of people. In order to avoid the reproduction of that situation here in the US, we instituted a very strict separation in the very first amendment between church and state. But what that has also done is that our political life, our public life, for the most part, has been deprived of any spiritual element. Let me give you an example. And I would suggest to you that, we can revisit. If I get to meet any of you 10 years from now, 20 years from now, perhaps we can revisit this. I don't want to say, I'm not going to make a claim, but I'm just going to make an observation. Today, there is a very strict reluctance to engage in any kind of bioengineering that would change the human fetus in ways that makes it better, faster, stronger, whatever, right? Giving it physical or intellectual attributes, to experiment on the human embryo and the human fetus. And on this question, people on the left and right are quite happily aligned. And the people on the left want that barrier that we have against manipulating the human genome to make super babies. And the people on the left are against it. Sorry. I think people on the left want those barriers to be removed. People on the right don't want those barriers to be removed. But I was reading an article this morning, and maybe this is an article of kind of like the same kind of fairy tales that were being told about the Islamic threats to the US. This might be about Chinese threats, but there's an article today with the former director of national security or artificial intelligence, the advisor to the president, basically said, we've lost. The US has lost that race. China is already way, way ahead in terms of what it's doing with AI and with biomedical engineering, because the kinds of debates that we have today about ethics, they're not interested in having. They've already opened doors that we are like, we don't even want to acknowledge the existence of. So the statement that I want to make, which I want to revisit in 20 years from now, is that if that fear is true and if those developments are true, chances are that the barriers that you see today that prevent us from experimenting with the human genome, those barriers would become more porous, would allow things to happen in the name of national security or something else. And that would reflect, according to Qutb, according to Emerson, according to a whole host of thinkers on the left and right, it would reflect the despiritualization of politics. Where if everything is manipulable and everything can be changed and nothing is sacred, then given enough time and the right blend of circumstances, everything will be manipulated, everything will be changed. And that the things that would prevent us from doing, stepping into God's shoes, those things that prevent us from doing that today will have no meaning for us tomorrow. So maybe in 20 years from now, it'll be a standard practice. Maybe my grandchild will be bioengineered to have thick head of hair. I don't know. For those who can't see. Qutb would say, and I think people in the West, like Emerson, and I'm throwing Emerson here, there's a whole bunch of people here, that is a loss. The lack of spiritualization in our politics is a loss. We have diminished ourselves in some fundamental way by not having that connectivity to the spiritual element that would be a guide for us, that would tell us, maybe not in the Nietzschean sense, but would tell us what's right and what's wrong. It would provide us with some kind of mooring, some kind of compass. For Qutb, it's not surprising that the Chinese are doing this, if in fact they're doing this, because communism, according to Qutb, is based on the principle of atheism. And atheism says all things are possible given the human capacity to grasp rationality and act in rational ways, or use scientific rationality to do whatever. Now, Qutb, interestingly enough, again, this is the geopolitical part that I found very interesting, is not against science. He thinks science should very much be used. It should be used to make human beings' lives better. But acting within and guided by the interpretation of divine law. Which is why, it sounds absurd to us at some level because, it's so different from our system of doing these things. But in Iran, in the short-lived ISIS caliphate, there were people whose job was to basically figure out if X practice or Y practice coming out of a scientific laboratory is religiously mandated or not. At some level, it's purely absurd. What does a 7th century text know about the extremely sort of sophisticated quantum level scientific developments that are happening in the world today? And yet the attempt to bring that stuff under control, bring it within the framework of some kind of religious interpretation, reflects the desire to spiritualize politics. Whereas for us, we are debating about whether we should have these things or not, but the tide is against us. If not at the level of manipulating the human genome, at the level of AI. In 20 years, that thing will be everywhere. That thing already is in lots of places right now. Your iPhone 13 is figuring stuff out based on AI technology. And the more you use it, the more you're feeding it, and the more advanced it's going to get. Yes?
I see the point that he's making, that there shouldn't be a separation between church and state allows you to do immoral things because you don't have anything sacred. But I would argue, I think that it's just, I don't think that, at least in the US, the state is as divided or it's as separate from the church as people make it out to be. Because I would say that the rhetoric that a lot of politicians use is soaked within Christian values and references. And I think that a lot of, if you just look at the presidents that we've elected, they're almost always white and Protestant. The first ever Catholic that we elected was JFK, and that was in the 60s. And I don't necessarily think we're as separated from religion as other countries would make us out to be. So I don't think that it's necessarily as accurate a critique if you don't recognize that religion still plays an important role.
I would actually incredibly disagree. I see your point, but I also see, in my experience of being Turkish, for example, and the actual substantial amount of weight that religion is placed on politics elsewhere in the Middle East as well, and not just in the Middle East, even in other European countries, especially in Western Europe, it is drastically different than the United States. And I think that the difference is that in the United States, religion still plays a very important role in our culture, and cultural aspects will have an effect on politics, inevitably. But religion doesn't necessarily dictate our actual government itself. So we don't look to the Bible for our ways of interpreting the Constitution. We still look at the Constitution, and in many ways we look at the Constitution in ways that are higher than the Bible itself. Which I think was an interesting, was it this or something else that they had mentioned how Sayyid Qutb looks at the Quran the way that many people look at the Constitution in America. But anyways, my point being that I do see your point that we are still a very religious society, but in a comparison, it is we do have, I think, a distinct separation of church and state, at least in the manner of our governmental functions.
Yeah, I'm Mercedes, I see your point. And I think, I don't know which Western country you're referring to, but certainly Turkey and Erdogan, that's very much going in the direction of trying to Islamicize Turkey away from the secularism of the young Turks, Kemal Ataturk, etc. I see your point, Mercedes, but I think whether the rhetoric translates into policy is a different question. And sure, you need to get elected because the vast majority of Americans think in religious terms, You need to show that you're a good Christian. There's a whole thing where, Barack Obama is a Muslim. That whole thing was built around the idea that only Christians should be president. But whether once elected president, they act necessarily in ways, as I said, that are informed by the Bible, even though they claim they are, is a different question. Andrew, you had your hand up?
I was gonna go off Belly's point because I can't really speak for the Middle East because that's a place I'm not too familiar with, but he was in Western Europe, like specifically like Spain, Italy,
Okay.
lots of, and I was gonna say Latin America, like the Catholic Church.
Scandinavian countries, sure. Okay.
Yeah, the Catholic Church was basically an institution that has no real comparison in America, and especially in Latin America, like I wouldn't say as much anymore, but the Catholic Church wielded insane amounts of political influence throughout the 20th century.
And I think according to, we're running out of time. According to Kutub, we are, and again, including thinkers in the West, thinkers who will read, we're the worst off for it. Because we can't decide, again, because of the equalization of values, we can't decide between what should we do and why we should do what we should choose to do. Okay, I have to stop here. But let me just, please, people write this down because we need to come back to it. So this is, for me, was the most interesting thing. There are elements of the feminist critique, weirdly, that Kutub partly articulates in ways, the parts that he gets wrong are just like catastrophically wrong. But there are things that he says about the distinction between the public and the private, and how that is so deeply entrenched into an understanding of politics that I think resonates with what Kutub has to say about contemporary society and how Islam is supposed to integrate this fundamental division between the public and the private. Were we supposed to debunk them?
Because you put the statement, like, it was like the last point on the lecture. It was like Edward Said's point.
Oh, yeah, okay, well, next time. All right, guys, online, adios.